The JavaScript reduce method that you can use on arrays tends to be one of the more kind of confusing methods, especially when you're just starting out. I know it definitely was for me. So my goal with this video is to give you a good understanding of the reduce method that you can use on arrays in JavaScript, and also some different kind of times and places in which it is a very useful method to use within your program. So first things first, the reduce method is an array method that you can use on any array that you create within your programs. And the reason that you kind of get this for free is because in JavaScript, it has this thing called a global array object that it gives you for free. JavaScript programs will have this array object in the global scope that you can use. And this array object on its prototype, it stores these different methods. So this is why you might see this written as array.prototype.reduce, because on the overall global array object, it stores this reduce method. And any array that you create within JavaScript is going to effectively inherit this method, and you're going to be able to use this on your arrays. So with the reduce method, one of the key things to remember is that it is a function that will take multiple things and it will reduce those things down into just one single output. So it takes multiple things and reduces it down into one thing. And the reduce method in JavaScript is going to take two arguments. The second one is optional. The first argument is going to be a callback function. So you are going to write some logic to take multiple things and reduce it down into one thing. And the second argument is an optional default value, which I'll explain here in just a second. Now, the reduce method, JavaScript will automatically pass your reduce method a few different arguments. The first argument is going to be an accumulator value. Whatever you return from your callback function that you pass in to reduce, whatever you return from that function is going to be passed as your accumulator value. Now, on your first iteration of your reduce loop, so to speak, you're not going to have a return value yet because it's your very first time. So this is where that second argument to reduce comes in, your default value. So on that first iteration, since you don't have a return value yet from your callback function, whatever you pass as a second argument to reduce, your default value, that will be your accumulator. And this will make more sense as I go through examples. But since that is an optional argument to reduce, if you don't pass that argument, then your first accumulator value will actually be the first value of your array in which you call reduce on. Okay, and all this will make more sense when I go through a couple of examples. So the first argument that is automatically passed to your callback function that you pass to reduce is going to be the accumulator value. And that is either going to be the default value. If you don't pass the default value, it's going to be the first item of your array that you call reduce on. Or if it's not the first iteration of your kind of reduce method, it's going to be the return value of your reduce callback function that you pass in as the first argument to reduce. Now, the second argument that reduce will pass to your callback function is going to be the current value of the array. So reduce is going to call your callback function on every value of your array, and it's going to pass that as the second argument. And then the third argument is going to be the index of that current value. And then the fourth argument is going to be the entire array itself. So like I said, if it's your first time in the reduce iteration, your accumulator will be your default value. And then if you don't pass a default value, it will be the first value of your array. And then whatever you return from your callback function, that will be passed as the accumulator during your next iteration or the next call to your function. So let me take you through an example so this makes more sense here. So here on line 24, I define an array and I define the values 1 through 6 in this number array. And then I define a function on line 26 called getSum. This function takes an accumulator as the first argument, the current value as the second argument, the index as the third argument, and then the entire array itself as the fourth argument. And then here on line 31, I call number array. I access the reduce method using .reduce. And then as the first argument, I pass in my callback function. And then, like I said, reduce will automatically pass in my accumulator value, the current value of the array. So it's going to go through every value of my array sequentially and pass that to this function. And it's going to call this function for every value of this array. And it's also going to pass the index and the array itself. And then here as the second argument, I pass an optional default value in which my first time through this iteration, my accumulator is going to be 0. So let me actually run this here. And I'm console logging my accumulator value, the current value, and the index and the array in every iteration so you can see what this looks like. So I run this here and you can see in my first iteration here, my accumulator value is 0 because that is what I passed as a default value to my reduce method. So my accumulator here is 0. And then my current value is 1 because that is the first value of my array. And then my index is 0 because the first value of my array is going to be at index 0, and then it passes the entire array itself. Now, here when I hit this line, it's going to take the accumulator and it's going to add it to the current value because I'm going to sum up this array here. I'm going to get the sum of this array. So it's going to take 1 plus 0, which evaluates to 1. And then at my next iteration, it's going to pass that value in as the accumulator. So here on my second iteration here, you can see the accumulator is 1 because that is the evaluated return value of my getSum function that I pass in. The current value is 2 because that is my second value of my array. My index is 1, and then it passes my entire array. And then here in this second iteration, I'm going to hit this line. It's going to take my accumulator, which is the value of 1. It's going to take my current value, which is the value of 2. It's going to add those together, which is the value of 3. And then it's going to return that, which is going to effectively pass that value as the accumulator in my next iteration, which you can see in my iteration number 3 here. My accumulator is 3, my current value is 3, my index is 2, and then it passes the entire array itself. And then here in my next iteration, it's going to add 3 plus 3, which is 6. It's going to take the current value, it's going to add those together, which gives me the accumulator of 10. My current value is 5. It's going to add those together and pass it to my next iteration, which is 15. And then it's going to add those together. And it's going to end with giving me the sum of this function, which if we see here is 21. Because my final value was 6, it's going to add 15 plus 6 to give me my final single output of this method to be 21. Because it took this collection of multiple things here and it reduced it down into one thing. Okay, so hopefully that makes things a little bit more clear. Whatever you return here in your callback function that you pass as your first argument to reduce is going to be your accumulator value on your next iteration of your reduce method. And in your first iteration, your accumulator is going to be your default value that you pass as the second argument here. And if you don't pass this default value, let me actually show that. What we'll see is on this first iteration, our accumulator is actually going to be 1 because that is the first value of my array. So if we can see it here, when I ran this, my first value this time around of my iterations was actually 1. Because if I don't pass the default value, it is just going to take the first value of my array as an accumulator, which in this instance, that's actually okay. We're okay with that. But often we're not. And it can cause errors if we kind of leave out that default value. So if you are using reduce methods and you're getting your code isn't compiling, you're getting some errors, I would check and see maybe it has something to do with not passing your default value. Now, we can actually do all of this in a bit less code overall, to where just like other functions or methods that take functions in JavaScript, we can just pass an inline function here. So this is actually pretty common to see with the reduce method. I would say sometimes with a reduce, it's more complex, and it can be helpful to actually define a function, write it out, and then pass it into reduce. But this is also completely valid, and it's still good practice to do this if it is kind of easier to reason about logic. So here I call reduce, I pass in this inline function here, which here I only worry about the accumulator value and the current value of my array. And then here, since this is just a single line function, it basically inserts the return value for me here. And then I take my accumulator plus my current value and I return those. And then if I run this here, you're going to see that I get the same sum. I get 21. Okay, so you can pass a inline function to the reduce method. You do not have to define it, but if it's anything that is even somewhat complex, I like to actually define the function here. So let's go through a couple more examples. I'm not going to go as slowly in these examples, but just to kind of show you some different ways you can use reduce. So here I have a string array in which I have different programming names. So JavaScript, Python, Dart, Rust, React, and you can see the case in these names. Some characters are uppercase, some characters are lowercase, and it just kind of looks a little bit wonky. So I'm going to create a underscored string. So I'm going to combine these strings together, and I'm going to combine them with underscores, but I'm also going to make all of these strings just lowercase. So it's going to basically join these strings together, but it's going to lowercase all the strings. So if I run this here, you're going to see that I get underscore JavaScript, underscore Python, underscore Dart, underscore Rust, underscore React. Because at each iteration, I'm going to take my accumulator, I'm going to place an underscore between my accumulator and my current value here. And then here on line 40, I just mutate my current value and I make it lowercase. So I call the toLowercase method. Now, as you can see here, since my default value here is an empty string, it is actually going to take a empty string on my first iteration. It's going to append a underscore to that empty string, and then it's going to add my first value. So if you see my return value here, I actually get a prepended underscore to this value because my first iteration was just an empty string. Now, if I leave this out here and then I run it, you're going to see that I get JavaScript underscore Python underscore Dart underscore Rust underscore React. But JavaScript isn't all lowercase because in this instance, JavaScript is passed as the accumulator in the first iteration, so it doesn't get lowercased here. Now, I could fix this kind of in a little bit of a hacky way here and just make sure I lowercase my accumulator as well. And that gives me kind of what you might expect from this function. There's different ways to do this, but that was more so an example to go to show that what you pass as a default value, it can matter. And it's important to understand how the reduce method works and that on that first iteration, it's going to pass your default value. And if you don't pass it, then your first iteration is going to just pass your first value of your array as your accumulator, and that value is never going to be your current value. Okay. And then here I show an example in which I basically do the same thing, but with an inline function here. So I do the same thing to where I make it lowercase and then I append a string kind of between them. And instead of using a template literal, I just use string concatenation here. So if I run that, you can see I get the same output as I did here. All right, so same thing. Inline functions are a totally valid way of writing your reduce methods. And then moving down here, this is where I think reduce becomes kind of most powerful. It's with using a little bit more complex data structures and reducing those down into kind of one single output. So here I have an object array, and my goal here is to basically reduce this object array down into a number of front-end programmers. So in my overall array object here, each object has a name. So a programming language name, it has the number of programmers that use that name. This is not accurate numbers. It's just for example purposes. And then I have a third property, which is stack, which tells me which part of the stack that these programmers work on. So front end, back end, and front end. So here, I actually just write an inline function here that takes an accumulator value and the current value, and then I check. If the current value dot stack is equal to front end, then I would return the accumulator plus the current dot programmers. So the amount of programmers that use this language. If that is not true, then I just return the accumulator and I keep going through the program here. And I give it a default value of 0. Now, one quick note here, this is probably not a good practice here to just use, this is what's called a magic constant here. It would be much better to define this constant up here and do something like this to where we can make this a little bit more dynamic and say if the cur.stack equals my constant stack. So then we could kind of change this on the go and make things more dynamic. And in general, it's a good practice to avoid magic constants. So generally a good practice not to use those magic constants like that. So here, if I run this here, you're going to see that I get the value that I would expect. I basically reduce this object array down into just the programmers that are using the front end stack. Okay, so this is an example of where you can take an array of more complex values, objects, and then reduce that down into a single output. So in summary here, let me kind of tie a bow on reduce here. So reduce is a function that you can use automatically within JavaScript because you can inherit from the overall array object, or effectively inherit. Now, reduce overall is a function that takes multiple things and reduces it down into one thing. Reduce takes 2 arguments. One is a callback function. Number 2 is a default value. If you don't pass the default value, then reduce will automatically use the first value of your array as the accumulator value, which kind of brings me to the reduce method will pass different arguments into your callback function. The first is the accumulator value, which, like I said, is either going to be the default value that you pass to reduce or the first value of the array. The second argument that reduce will pass to your callback function is going to be the current value of your array. The third one is going to be the index, and the fourth is going to be the overall array itself. And then whatever you return from your callback function, that's going to be passed as the accumulator to your next iteration of your kind of reduce loop. And then whatever is returned from your very final call to your callback function with the very final value of the array, that is going to be your overall single output of your reduce method. So I hope this kind of helped clear up reduce. I definitely recommend playing around with some examples yourself to gain a better understanding of this. If you're interested in learning about other array methods, I have some videos on those as well. So I appreciate your time, and I'll catch you in that next one.